two, one.
Hi everyone, welcome to LunchBreak. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Carrie, and today we're talking with artist Jared Vaughan Davis. Jared is based in Florida, and he explores the connection between art and science by drawing on topics like astronomy, neuroscience, physics, science fiction, and the science of belief. He's been a part of the SciArt community for many years and has been in exhibits including SciArt's Distinguishable From Magic. So thank you for being with us today, Jared. If you have questions you'd like to ask Jared throughout the talk, you can type them into the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. To start off, can you give us an overview of your work, what mediums you use, and what subjects you focus on?
Of course. First of all, let me just say thank you for having me. I think these lunch breaks are really cool. I haven't been able to watch all of them live, but I was able to go on the SciArt Initiative's YouTube channel yesterday and watch all the ones that I hadn't seen yet, and just so incredibly impressed with the artists and their work. And I really do think that some of the most interesting work being done in the contemporary art world right now is coming from the SciArt community. So I'm just humbled to be a part of this and excited to share my stuff. So a little about my work. I am an image maker. My background is in graphic design and art direction. And my fine art practice really centers around a couple of big questions and big concepts. Like the other artists that have already participated in these lunch breaks, I am interested in big questions. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What happens when we die? Big questions like this. And the question that you're seeing on your screen now is one that is really at the core of all of my artwork and really my intellectual life in general. And this is a question that has been posed a lot of different ways, but I first came upon it from the American philosopher John Searle in his book, Minds, Brains, and Science. And the question is, if the picture of reality that science has provided us is correct, and our world really is made up entirely of mindless, meaningless particles, as described by atomic physics, how do we reconcile this picture with our self-conception as conscious, free, mindful, moral, rational, social, language-speaking agents? So an example of this would be, how do we reconcile our experience of love or fear with the scientific explanation of those emotions as merely chemical and electrical reactions in the brain? Or how do we reconcile the way it feels to have human morality with examples of empathy and morality that we encounter in the animal world from elephants or dolphins or the higher primates? So, of course, in the past, until the last several centuries and even today, things like consciousness and free will and morality and reason were explained using spiritual or religious explanations. So here in the 21st century, for those of us that are scientifically minded, those sort of spiritual answers really don't suffice. So how do I reconcile the scientific description of reality, of the universe, of myself, with these self-conceptions? And I do that through art and philosophy. For me, I am someone who thinks of philosophy as the way to ask questions about the world and about myself. Science is the way that I get answers to those questions. Science is about explaining the natural world. And art is what I use to respond to those questions and those explanations. So one of the main concepts that sort of underlies my fine art practice is this notion of what I call romantic naturalism. And this is a term that I came up with um, doing my Master's of Art and Science at Central St. Martin's. And here, romantic is referring to romanticism, which can generally be associated with exaltation or imagination or self-realization. And naturalism, of course, is the starting point of science. It is the belief that uh, everything that exists in the natural world, that there is no world beyond nature. There is no supernatural world. So terms like spirit and soul and monads, these are terms that we no longer use in science. And the quantum physicist Sean Carroll actually really explains this much better than I ever could by calling it poetic naturalism. And it's an emphasis on this unification of philosophy and art and science to talk about the natural world. And another big concept that underlies my work is that of metamodernism. And I won't go into this too much because it's a controversial and complicated topic, but it's an attempt at creating a postmodernism. And the thing that is most important from this movement is the concept of oscillations. So in my work, both in the concepts that I'm dealing with and in the materials themselves, oscillations play a very, very important role. So moving back and forth between a sort of modernist seriousness and a postmodern humor or irony, between optimism and nihilism, between expressing how much we don't know scientifically and how much we actually do know, how vast human knowledge actually is. And so this first image, one called Ionian Enchantment, I thought this was a good image to start with because it, I think, highlights some of those oscillations, both conceptually and in the way I create many of my images. So for example, this image started out with a sketch of some geometric objects, which I then used marker and watercolor on paper to create a few of these geometric images, and then scanning those, bringing them into the digital space, creating a composition, bringing in some of the space astronomical imagery, and then printing that image out and doing some more handwork on top. So a lot of my images that you'll see as I go through them, that really is my process a lot of the time, sketching or doing work by hand, then going into Photoshop or Illustrator or some other digital program, and then printing things out and doing more handwork, and sometimes going back into the digital space. So really this back and forth, this oscillation between traditional mediums and the digital mediums is something that's really at the core of my work. So I'm just going to blast through a bunch of images now so you can get a sense of the sort of work I do. This is, I think, another good example of where I'm combining art and philosophy and science to create not necessarily abstract images, but images that use astronomical photography and also geometric forms, geometric imagery. That's something you'll see a lot in my images going forward. And a lot of the topics that I'm dealing with are based on my reading. So these two images that you're seeing here, the moon illusion and ontological incompleteness, are both images that these concepts came from reading articles in Scientific American. The moon illusion is a concept where we see the moon as being much larger the closer it is to the horizon. And I was reading about this in Scientific American, and that took me down a rabbit hole of investigating this phenomenon and its relationship to psychology, to neuroscience, and to philosophy. Same with ontological incompleteness. Again, space imagery, geometric imagery, and a lot of different philosophical concepts baked into some of these images that I'm creating. Some of the images that I make are obviously much more abstract, and some of them are more illustrative. So the image on the left, this one started off with a colored pencil drawing, which I then brought into Photoshop and started playing with the geometric forms and the color and the astronomical imagery. The one on the right is sort of purely abstract. So I kind of move back and forth between things that use more realistic imagery and things that are just purely abstract. These are some more abstract images, and some of these really aren't necessarily related to science so explicitly, but they're ideas that I'm dealing with or exploring that are more philosophical. For example, construction and deconstruction and reconstruction. And over on the right, you see again more geometric forms and overlaying those on other types of realistic imagery. A couple of images here that are a little more explicitly dealing with science. The one on the left is an abstraction of the Large Hadron Collider. The images on the right are some manipulated photographs that I took of ancient hominid skulls, which I photographed at the Grant Museum of Zoology. So I definitely like to take photographs of things that I am seeing at museums or even just from nature, and then abstracting those, bringing in space imagery to sort of straddle the line of science and philosophy, and even sort of science fiction. A few more images. One on the left, you can see some abstracted forms that hint towards nature and again space. Over on the right, this one was sort of abstraction of Russian satellite. And some of these are a little more closer to portraits. Over on the left, a portrait of Marie Curie, and dealing with biological imagery. Again, on the right, this was an illustration of a gallbladder that was at the Gordon Museum of Pathology. Was fortunate enough to visit their museum and spend the better part of 2 days illustrating one of the specimens that they had there at the museum. And then some more illustrative stuff over on the left, Aristotle. Over on the right, a little bit more silly take on the Scopes monkey trial. This one was done in 2014, so that was the 89th anniversary of the Scopes monkey trial. Um, and then this one, coming to the end of some of the images here, this was actually my degree show piece that I did at Central St. Martin's. I was fortunate enough to be in the second class of the Masters of Art and Science program there at Central St. Martin's. And I believe they were the first school, certainly in Europe, and I believe possibly in the world, to have a master's program devoted entirely to art and science. And this was my degree showpiece called Illusion of the Self. I worked with a doctor at the Wolfson Institute for Biomedical Research who was studying the glial cells in the brain. And so I was using her imagery and this concept of the illusion of the self, and going back to that sort of opposition between neuroscience, the self being again just chemical and electrical reactions in the brain, and the way it feels to have the self. So combining these images of the cells with images of the human face into this larger installation piece. So a lot of collage in my work, a lot of taking scientific imagery and combining that with other types of imagery to sort of ask questions about the self, about the universe. And then the final one I'll look at here, you can see up in the top left, those are some of the images of skulls that I showed a little bit earlier, but this was from an artist residency in 2015 where a group of 5 different quote unquote Sci artists were working together to explore these ideas related to art, science, philosophy, neuroscience, and the development of scientific ideas over the centuries. So it's a little bit hard to see over on the right, but a lot of those images relate to a timeline of cosmologies. So ancient cosmologies all the way into our sort of scientific description of reality in the present. So that's kind of a crash course in what I do. And I'm sure there's a lot more I could say about it, but to keep things terse, I think I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you. So interesting to see how many different mediums and concepts your work covers. So what have you been working on recently?
Recently, I've been doing some more abstractions. These are, again, digital and mixed media pieces, a little less explicit in their relationship to science, although I'm drawing from some scientific concepts, again, related to my reading. And so really working again with this back and forth between traditional mediums and digital mediums, trying to, in some sense, blur the line between what is a digital image and what is an image created with markers, colored pencils, watercolor, acrylic, and challenging the viewer to determine, is this something that was created in Photoshop? Is this something that is a painting? And moving back and forth between those different types of materials. And also, I've been doing a lot more sort of pure illustration this year. Over on the left, just some sort of slightly abstracted imagery using butterflies. This one was done just using colored pencils. Over on the right, you can see that's a Godzilla up in the top right. So I am interested in sort of science fiction and things of that nature, some more nature illustration, and in the bottom right, this was a pen and ink drawing of a tree and a temple that I was able to photograph when I was in Cambodia. So I've been doing a little bit more on the illustrative side and working more with colored pencils, markers, and ink. And then going back to the digital side, these are some images I created using, combining my hand-drawn, my traditional images created with marker, colored pencil, etc., and then run through the Google Deep Dream generator. These were images that I was actually inspired to make because of the open call that SciArt initiative has right now for the, is it deep fake?
Yeah,
I
deep
believe,
fake.
right, the deep fake show. I'm sorry, I forgot that, but there's the open call for right now that's going to be taking place later in the year in Los Angeles. So it was the first time that I experimented using the Google Deep Dream generator, and it's really taken my own images and plugging them into this generator, manipulating them with some different filters, which is really something that I do in a different way in Photoshop already. So it was a unique sort of experiment to play around with the Google Deep Dream generator and see some of these weird hallucinatory images that get cranked out of those generators. So a lot of experimentation. I do relate my practice to science in some sense by the way that I sort of come up with an idea and then it's a lot of trial and error. What works, what doesn't work, what is, what helps me produce more beautiful images, what doesn't work at all. So I'm also really inspired by the philosopher Karl Popper, who popularized the notion of permanent revolutions in science. And in my fine art, I really am all about changing things up, experimenting, not sort of settling for one style or one aesthetic or one type of material, but really trying a lot of different things and seeing what works and what doesn't.
Thank you. And thanks for mentioning deepfake.
Yeah.
If anyone listening, if you have artificial intelligence related art, you can still submit to that until the 24th. And if anyone has questions for Jared, please type those into the Q&A box and we'll get to those at the end. So to finish up, where can we see your work next, or where can we look to keep up with what you're doing?
Sure. Currently, if you look over on the left, I do have a few pieces in the Art Center Sarasota exhibition that was meant to be going on now in the Art Center Sarasota space. It has been moved online, and you can see this was a postcard exhibition. So artists were invited by the Art Center to create 3 or more postcard works of art. And so you can see over on the left some of my experiments and some of the uncut and cut postcards that I created there. You can see those now at the Art Center Sarasota website. Those postcards were auctioned off without the artist name to as a fundraiser for the Art Center. And that's online now. You can view some of that work there. My wife also has work in that show. She's also an extremely, extremely talented artist. So you can check out some of her work there. Vaughan Davis is her name. And then My first solo show is scheduled to open in December at the Lexile Gallery in Sarasota. I'm not sure whether that will be happening in the space, whether that will be postponed, but the title of the show is Consilience, which refers to, as I mentioned at the beginning, this unification of art, science, and philosophy. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm very nervous about it. It would be my first solo show. I've had my work in dozens and dozens of group shows, but this would be my very first solo show. So if things sort of clear up, I guess we could say, and we're moving back into exhibition spaces. Hopefully you'll get to see my work there. If not, you can always see my work online at my website, jaredvaughandavis.com, and of course on social media as well.
Great. I think Julia is going to jump in now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jared. This is Julia jumping in for the Q&A portion of this. So a question in from the audience. We have time for about 1 or 2 questions. The question is, for your digital works, when you exhibit them, what types of materials do you like to print on? What media is kind of your favorite for printing? Do you do paper or metal or framed, or because there's so many options out there, right?
As I mentioned, I like to experiment. I have done things on metal and aluminum. I've done things on glass. I tend to prefer paper because, as I mentioned, a lot of times I do handwork over the prints. So whether that's acrylic or marker, or sort of sometimes I'll use a clear medium or different types of acrylic in parts of the image. And I think working on paper lends itself well to going back over the prints with colored pencils, markers, paints, etc. But I've experimented with a lot of different materials, plastics, aluminum, metals. And I do like to frame things so long as I can afford it. The framing gets extremely expensive sometimes, so sometimes I have to get creative with presentation and do things like hanging. And I'm really actually looking forward to, in the solo show that I mentioned, doing some projection work and seeing what types of materials I can print on and then project over those prints. So I don't necessarily have a single preferred method, but a lot of times it is paper, and I frame them so that it is a challenge for the viewer to determine whether it's a painting or a drawing or purely digital.
That's awesome. I can't wait to see what you do with these projections. That's a whole new direction, right? So that sounds really exciting. Can't wait to see photos. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. But Carrie, if you want to wrap us up here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jared. This has been really fascinating. Thanks for everyone listening in. Our next lunch break will be Wednesday, the 22nd, with Scott McIntyre. So tune in then and join our mailing list to stay up to date at sciartinitiative.org. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.